From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., the Congressional Report, with your host, Iowa Congressman Tom Latham.
This country is based on farms, on small businesses, and creating jobs and opportunities. That is the lifeblood of this nation.
And now your host, Congressman Tom Latham.
Hello, and thank you for joining me. The economic downturn has cost the American economy millions of jobs. Working families across the country continue to tighten their belts as they struggle with high unemployment and growing uncertainty. The federal government has implemented a number of policies in an effort to spark job growth, including a $862 billion stimulus package. Despite those efforts, national unemployment has hovered near 10%, and economic recovery remains slow and tenuous. Joining me today to discuss the stimulus bill is Veronique Rugy of George Mason University Mercatus Center. Welcome to the Congressional Report, Mercatus, and Veronique.
Thank you for having me,
from the
Congressman.
Mercatus Center. Tell us about yourself. What's your background? And
I have a PhD in economics, and I'm a senior research fellow for the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. The Mercatus Center is a university-based research center, so it means we're affiliated, we're independent but affiliated with George Mason University. And my specialty is mainly tax and budget, and basically what I do is that I look at the impact that taxes and spending do have on our everyday lives.
Okay. The subject we want to talk about is the stimulus package and unemployment. What effect has this had? The whole, it's up to now $862 billion
Yes.
because it hasn't worked all that well, and so there's more costs involved.
The increase in costs comes from the fact that, as you said, while the rationale behind the stimulus bill was to create jobs, basically spend money, government money, which is really taxpayers' money, to create jobs, it hasn't worked. So basically the increase from $789 billion to $862 billion now comes from extension of the unemployment benefits. So it hasn't really worked at all. One of the things that we probably need to remind your viewers is that before the stimulus bill was passed, one of the things that President Obama kept stressing is that if we did not pass this massive spending bill, which is the biggest in our history, unemployment would reach 8.8%. And as you said in your introduction, we've been around 10% for quite a while.
Right. Where do you get your information? What do you base your research on?
So my colleague Jerry Brito and I recently, what we've done is that we've taken all the data that is made available by the president on his website, recovery.gov, which is basically the job created or saved as reported by the recipient of the money. We've cleaned it up because if you remember all the news reports, there's a lot of phantom district and things like this, and address that do not exist.
We had 28 districts in Iowa where we have 5.
Yeah, something like this. So we've cleaned it up. We've organized, we assigned the right zip code, and also we've used a lot of data from publicly available sources like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau, and then what we've done is we've ran regression analysis to actually try to see and understand how the money was appropriated. But that's where we get our data. And by the way, that data which we've cleaned up, and we're going to do it every quarter, as each time the president releases new data, we're going to clean it up, and we've made it available on our website at mercatus.org for everyone to use, and you can run your own regression analysis, you can look for your own correlation, you can do your own chart. It's all there for you to use.
Fantastic. Break down the stimulus package for us. Everyone thinks that most of the money went towards building new roads and bridges and infrastructure. That really isn't the case.
No, it's not the case. So originally there were almost $800 billion, and 2/3 of that was actual spending. The rest were tax breaks and things like this, and it's not actually exactly clear. I mean, on the spending side, some of the things that were called tax credits were actual spending. So it's the effect of like you send a check to people, so it's actual spending. But roughly $500 billion of that money, or a little less, was actual spending on programs. But not everything went to the Department of Transportation. There were a lot of it went to the Department of Education, Agriculture. HUD got a lot of money. I mean, there are a lot of departments that got money, and also that money was broken down between grants and loans made by the government. And all this data is actually available, and you can actually read and understand more what the stimulus money is about going to recovery.gov, which is, again, President Obama's promise of transparency, even though it needs a lot of cleaning up.
Can you explain, obviously we threatened with the economy, higher unemployment. It was about 7 or 7.5%, I think, when the stimulus bill was passed, and like we talked about, almost 10% now. But the rationale behind it, what is it? Was it more actually to create jobs, or was it there's a lot of intergovernmental transfers of money with Medicaid, with different programs inside government? The rationale, how was this supposed to create jobs?
The way this was supposed to create jobs is this idea that right now we have this recession and we've lost a lot of jobs because consumers are worried, or they're not spending, basically. So people have lost their jobs, and they're not going to buy the things that they would otherwise buy. Investors are not investing because they're worried. Small business have to fire their employees. So the idea behind the stimulus bill was this Keynesian, from the idea of John Maynard Keynes, that if the government injects money into the economy and puts it directly in the hands of the private sector, then you, for instance, you get some of this government money. You either hire someone with this $1 that you've paid someone. This person is going to either save some of that money, but it will consume, and that $1 turns into more than $1, and it actually jumpstarts the economy. It's the multiplier effect of government spending. That was the actual idea behind the way it was explained to the American people. The reality is quite different.
I want to know what the reality is. Why didn't it work then? Because it's spending an awful lot of money.
It is spending an awful lot of money. Well, it's not working because it's actually never worked. I mean, historically, there are no concrete evidence of government spending ever jump-starting a recession. Even the New Deal that's been talked about a great deal, where President Roosevelt spent a lot of money, now economists and political historians agree that this did not get us out of the recession. And the reason is simple, is that the government tends to think that it has money of its own. And it does look simple when you think about it, right? I'm the government, I give you $1, and then you spend it, as I've explained. The problem is that this dollar needs to come from somewhere. The government doesn't have money of its own, and that's true whether it's the federal government or whether it's the state government or the local government, right? It has to take it somewhere. And basically what the stimulus money does is that it just take the money from one part of the economy and inject it in another part of the economy, usually without thinking about what business people think about, which is the concept of loss and profit, how to actually get positive return on your investment, and with the government taking a share of this money. And it doesn't work this way. And we've seen that it has not worked.
There's a lot of talk about, the unemployment rate of nearly 10%, but also the people who have quit looking for work. Explain that, and that's not counted in the 10%.
No, it's
Where,
not.
what is the actual unemployment, do you know?
Well, I wouldn't be able to tell you what exactly the number would be, but I could tell you that if we actually took under consideration the people who've exited the labor force, it would be much higher. The way it works, and I wish it was actually better known than it is, but we talk a lot about unemployment. These are like people who are actively still looking for a job. However, there's a part of there's a significant amount of people. We're talking about 600,000 people in the month of December. That's a lot of people who've actually decided to stop looking, or have decided that, you know, they could be looking for a job, but it just really wasn't worth it right now at this time of their life, or that the prospect of what they would get by working would actually not be interesting. And I can give you a very concrete example that I've seen with my own eyes. The Mercatus Center at GMU we have master students, and while they're done, when they're done with their masters, they decide whether they want to go and pursue a PhD or whether they want to go and work. And a lot of them, if they sign up just for a master's, they go and look for work. And there was this student of ours, a very brilliant guy, his name is Mark, and he looked for a job for 3 months. He did not want to, and I kept telling him, Mark, go get a PhD, it's great. And he was like, no, I want to get a job. And he looked for a job, and he could not find one. And I mean, he worked for free for 3 months, and then he decided to pursue a PhD. A lot of that happens. A lot of people who were actually looking for jobs went back to school. A lot of women who were looking for jobs decided to stay at home, take care of their kids instead of paying a nanny, and eventually getting a job that's very poorly paid.
Obviously, your evaluation of the stimulus package, that it hasn't. What would happen if we hadn't passed the stimulus bill? Well, if it hadn't been passed, I didn't vote for it, but that's
so. One of the, you know, it's there's always, you know, every side is always telling its story about what would have happened if we didn't pass it, and the other side is like, what would have happened? But one of the things that we know for sure is the economy would have recovered without the stimulus. This is what the economy does. It's always does it, especially the American economy, which is extremely resilient. I would like to remind people what happened after 9/11, which was a massive trauma to our economy. And yet, the economy recovered relatively quickly, I mean, impressively quickly, actually. So what would have happened is that the economy would have started to recover, because once you don't have the government intervening and telling you you're going to get this money or you're going to get this tax cut, people are more certain about what their future is about. And actually, one of the real problems with the government intervention is, on one side, the effect that this injection of federal money has directly on the economy, but it's also all the insecurity and uncertainty that it introduces. I mean, when you listen and read the paper, there's just really not a week without, you know, the administration announcing a new program, a new plan to either spend or not spend money, to give a tax break here or that. And what happens is that when people don't know whether they might be able to get a better deal in the future, but they just wait.
That's human nature involved.
Yes, exactly. And you know what? It actually also works with tax cuts, right? Yeah. One of the things that I always heard about the Reagan tax cuts is that they would have been better if they had been done in one phase rather than two, because a lot of people waited for phase two before they started acting.
Well, what effect is when this is all spin out, and a lot of the money actually hasn't gone out. It's the second, third, even fourth year of the stimulus package before the money.
Well, right now we've spent including the tax cuts and the tax credit and all this, roughly $250 billion. It's like 25% of the stimulus at the end of 2009.
When that's all spent, though, we're talking with interest, well over $1 trillion. What effect is that borrowing? And it's not like the government has any money to begin with. We're borrowing all of this money. Long term, you talk about the uncertainty of the future, but doesn't that have a huge drag on the whole economy going forward?
Yeah,
so in essence, it could actually end up being a very negative impact on long-term growth?
I'm really glad you're asking this question, because it's actually one of the questions that I think a lot of people don't quite understand. You know, we always talk about the size of the federal debt, but the D word is not really persuasive. People don't really understand whether deficit matter or don't, whether the debt matters or it doesn't. But one thing actually to try to educate people, that have been an example I've been using is, like, imagine that you're maxing out all your credit cards all the time. And what happens if you want to spend some more? What you do if you're really fiscally responsible is, like, you ask for another card, you roll your balance over, and you spend even more without even paying your debt. Well, there's a moment where your lender, your bank, starts realizing what a liability you represent. And even if you have, like, a catastrophic event in your life and you need money, or if it's just to buy an extra pair of very expensive shoes, if you go and say, I'm going to do the same trick and borrow that money for this spending, your lender is going to say, well, I'm sorry, if you really want this credit card, it's not going to be a 12% interest rate that you're going to get. It's a 30% interest rate. And that's what the federal government is doing. It's been rolling over short-term debt, and our lenders are going to wise up to this reality that the federal government might never repay them. And then what happens when that happens, and it's not a question of whether it will happen or not, it's when it's going to happen, especially if we stay the course and gives no sign of being fiscally responsible. They're going to increase the interest rate too, and there's nothing the Fed will be able to do. And what happens there now when the interest rate increases? Capital becomes more expensive. Everything that you want to do will come at a higher price. Investing in your business, buying a house, investing in your kids' future, everything. And it's a big deal.
And because as a citizen, you're competing against your government for access to capital, and having to pay more on your home mortgage, your car mortgage, student loan, everything.
Especially, I mean, it's quite interesting, you know, like I worked a lot on the inefficiency or not of the capital market, and of course I was of the opinion that the capital market is actually quite efficient. And I was reading a lot of literature about the 80s, and one of the things that used to happen in the 80s, like when because the world was not as open, right? The capital market was something that was quite close. So when the federal government invested money, that was money that was taken away from the private sector. It wasn't true anymore at the end of the 80s and the 90s and at the beginning of the 21st century. But now that the capital market, the world capital market, is in big trouble, we're back to this situation where there actually isn't that much capital flowing around. So the more the federal government borrow, the less there is for the private sector.
It's a scary proposition. In the last week, Chairman Veronique of the Federal Reserve talked, and we could heading for a scenario like the country of Greece, in essence bankruptcy, and it's very concerning to me. I've seen where the stimulus package by itself, when it's all spent out, it'll be about $100 million a day in just interest to support the borrowing that was done for that. Well, getting back to the stimulus again, what should we have done? What would have actually worked and stimulated the economy? Doing nothing, changing the way the package was put together. What would you have suggested?
So, what I would have done absolutely is certainly not spend all this money on infrastructure and shovel-ready project and give money to education and all of that. What I would have done actually to stimulate the economy like this is, like, I would have actually, and that costs some money, but I would have actually implemented maybe a 5-year-old cut of the payroll tax in half, because that, and small business probably tell you, right, small business owner, that costs instantly the cost of keeping your employees and of hiring employees. So this is like the first thing I would have done. I would have cut also the corporate income tax rate, which is the second highest of all the OECD country. When you put the state and the federal rate, it's like 40%. It's really important. It's a big cost of doing business. Ideally, I would reform the entire system, but in the short run, I would have cut the rate. That is what I would have done. And of course, I would have spent money on extended unemployment benefit in the short run.
Right. You had mentioned earlier that you track how the money has been spent, and a lot of concerns have been voiced about the accuracy of those numbers and if they actually work. Do you find the numbers that are provided or the information, is it valid, is it good? All these different congressional districts and things like that are input errors apparently. But
yes, so measuring and tracking down how much jobs were created is extremely difficult, right?
How do you count how many jobs are saved?
Well, so that was my second point, is like how many jobs were saved is impossible. And in fact, I don't want to be cynical, but I'm assuming that this was the plan behind the administration first saying that they were going to measure how much jobs were created, and then moving to a definition of created and saved. It is impossible. It's absolutely impossible to measure how many jobs were saved. In fact, I blog a lot, and I've been tracking down how much money was used from the stimulus to actually pay for picnic tables, installment of picnic tables, and I looked at the same company how much contract they would get, and that one company actually called me, and the guy told me how proud he was that he had never laid off anyone ever in his career, and he was a good, deserving American. And I was thinking, interesting. If your company is doing so well, then why should you be getting that money? But it's impossible. Yeah. Plus, the problem is we can't track the money down. So we can, the way it is done now, we can actually follow the money trail down to the contractor when the grant goes or the loan goes to a private individual, but we don't really know how that money is actually spent, and the trail ends with the agency, the federal agency, when the money goes to the federal agency, and we don't know how that federal agency or state government spend the money. So there's just a lot we don't know.
How many new employees has the federal government hired to implement the stimulus package? I'd heard numbers that we're probably going to have to hire over time 200,000 new employees basically to shovel the money out.
I don't know exactly. Yeah. One of the things that I know, however, is that when I looked at where the money was going, based on the recovery.gov website, I found out that the administration claimed to have created or saved less than 600,000 jobs, and 2/3 of this were public jobs.
Yeah.
It's possible that among these, some was actually spent through the private sector, but I can't tell you. But 2/3 of this were
in the public sector, and that's probably one reason why the unemployment rate in Washington D.C. here is very low.
We're doing very well.
Doing very well
in recession times. Yeah. Well, the other thing is like I actually looked at unemployment rates and employment data for the private sector and for the government sector, and one of the things that I found is in the last 2 years, the private sector has lost 8.7 million jobs, and the public sector has gained 100,000. 100,000 is not much, but I would rather be a public employee than a private sector employee.
Right job security today. Yeah.
There's more.
As my background's a family business, selling soybean seed around on the road all the time, and you take great pride in a family business. Small business people work very, very hard. And what bothers me today is that, and I think small businesses are the engine for growth really as far as hiring people, But it seems to me, in talking to other small business people, that with the prospect of marginal tax rates going up next year, with capital gains tax rates going up, the uncertainty about what cap and trade is going to cost, healthcare reform, the new mandates and new costs for small businesses, until there's some certainty out there, small businesses are basically frozen in place. And you talk to, the bankers on Main Street today, and they'll tell you that it isn't about liquidity or capital. It's about the demand, because the small businesses are frozen. What do we need to do to break this loose?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you should say this at the time where the second job bill is going through Congress, right? And is made mainly about the wrong things. Basically, it's made about tax credits for people who are going to be hiring, but there's no tax credit to be used if you don't have a tax liability, if you don't have customers, and more importantly, if you actually don't know how much excess in taxes you're going to have to pay next year, because the Bush tax cuts are going to expire, and a lot of small business are reporting their business income under the personal income tax. So there's all this uncertainty. So this I would not have done. There's also a part of using TARP money, right, to stimulate community lending. Same thing. I mean, it's useless, because until you have uncertainty, such uncertainty, and we're still in this recession, there's not going to be a demand for loans. So what I would do is I would try to actually lessen the burden of people who actually have employees right now, to make sure that they're not placed in a position where they have to actually let go these employees. So again, I would cut the payroll tax, which would cost money, but much less than we can use the rest of the stimulus money to actually cut the payroll tax. I would reduce regulation on these small businesses. I would actually lift all the loopholes that small businesses have to do to hire someone, and I would just reduce the uncertainty in the system, and maybe President Obama could say that he's not gonna pursue cap and trade, and maybe we should just promise the American people that the Senate bill or the House bill is not going to pass on health care.
It's huge issues, obviously, to get this economy going. And just very briefly, because I think we're about out of time, but the debt long term, if we're going to more than double the national debt, that's going to have a dramatic impact on future generations, and what that does to our kids, grandchildren, and their children. The opportunities are going to be less in the future, aren't they?
Well, absolutely, and it's really sad. I mean, like for my children, I mean, I didn't move from France because I thought the U.S. was a country that was worse to raise kids than France. I thought it was going to be a better place, and I'm just really worried about this.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I could go on for much longer, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Congressman.
In order to make the best possible decisions for our economy, we must first gauge how successful previous policies have been. A year after enactment of the $1 trillion stimulus bill, American families are hurting and unemployment remains high. Before we take the next step, we need to make sure we're doing the right thing for the American taxpayers to get our economy going. Thank you again for tuning in, and I hope you'll join me again next time on the Congressional Report.
From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., this has been the Congressional Report with Iowa Congressman Tom Latham. Have a question, comment, or concern? Congressman Latham wants to hear from you.